Hello there. Today I'm interviewing Patrick Mineault, who has a PhD from McGill and did a postdoc at UCLA. He's an independent scientist and a neural data scientist. His interests are neuroscience and the connection to machine learning. He has an awesome blog called XCore, which I guess is pronounced cross-correlation, but who knows? So please check out Patrick's blog. He also worked at Google for a while, seeing how people interact with web pages, and was a brain-computer interface engineer at Facebook Reality Labs. He also has launched the Neuromatch Academy, which is sort of an academy where you learn in a summer school about computational neuroscience. This runs every year and you can take part if you want. We're going to touch on that a little bit in the interview. I just wanted to take it away beforehand. So I'm going to give a little introduction about what we'll talk about, and then we'll jump into the interview. We are going to talk mainly about this blog post right here, the 2021 in review unsupervised brain model. The main focus here is on unsupervised models and what they have to do with the brain. So a big question in neuroscience is, how does the brain work? I guess it's the main question in neuroscience. And so people are developing the hypotheses of how the brain works, and deep learning turns out to be quite an interesting tool for neuroscientists, because in deep learning we get some inspiration from neuroscience, but essentially we build a model that end to end can learn some task, to perform some tasks. So this would be this one right here. Now the question is what deep models do the same or different than what brains do, given that they solve the same task? Like, let's say both recognize objects on images. Do they do the same thing, or do they do something completely different? So neuroscientists, they wonder, how does the brain learn stuff? Is it the same as neural network? Does the neural network now... Also, during the interview, I have to stop saying neural network because it's ambiguous in this context. So does a deep network, a human-made deep network, does it account for neural activity? Which means that, are the signals in the deep network the same or related to the signals that we see in the brain? And this turns out to be a very important tool for neuroscientists. What they want to see is that, let's say, the intermediate representations in the neural network, like you have some kind of picture, it goes into a neural network, there's layer, and then there's a classification head. The classification head might not be that interesting, but what is interesting is like some intermediate representation here. If we figure out that explains, which means we can correlate it with things that are in the brain, and I'm going to draw like a very bad brain right here. If we can correlate this with things that are found in the brain, signals like from fMRI, from electrodes that we put into people's heads, then that is an indication that what these deep networks are doing have something like, there is an effect that is similar, and that could help us understand the brain. So the holy grail in neuroscience would be something that can perform the same task as humans, that does account for neural activity, that is biologically plausible. As you might know, there is still a debate of whether something like backprop is implementable in the brain in one way or another, or if we need an entirely different mechanism in the brain. And lastly, something that could conceivably also have evolved, and maybe we'd even have some evidence of how it evolved over time. So we're going to talk about these models right here, specifically self-supervised models. Self-supervised models, here is a slide by Yann LeCun, are models that don't need labels to train. And what you usually do is you block out part of something you know and then try to predict that from the parts that you do know. For example, if it is an image, again, you'd block out some part of the image, and then from the rest of the image, you'd try to predict that part. That is a self-supervised method. There's also contrastive methods which are self-supervised, which means that you'd have an image and you make two different views of it, for example, by cropping the image in different places, and then you try to train a model that can tell that these two things actually belong together, come from the same image, and that they are apart from, I'm going to draw inverted arrows right here. They are apart from like a third image that has nothing to do with this image. These are contrastive methods. And it turns out that if we build models that learn in self-supervised, in contrastive ways, and especially in multimodal ways, that we end up with models that can explain brain activity fairly well. So we're going to jump into the papers right here in the interview pretty quickly, but if you keep watching the interview, Patrick goes also into more like high-level explanations of neuroscience in general. It is a bit my fault that I immediately was like, so what does this paper say? But I promise you, if you keep listening throughout the interview, there are great insights into the entire field of neuroscience, into what are open questions, into where can people go to learn about this, and if you even want to research this. If you're in deep learning right now and you're interested in neuroscience, this, Patrick says, it's a wide open field. There's lots of papers to be published, and the conferences are, especially something like NeurIPS, are pretty receptive to papers that connect deep learning with neuroscience, or in general try to explain neuroscience things. So as I said, we're going to jump into the interview now. I don't want to spend too much more time because we're very detailed in the interview. Check out Patrick's blog and all his other endeavors, and I wish you a lot of fun. Bye. Hello everyone. Today here with me I have Patrick Mineault, who is a neuroscientist slash blogger slash anything else that you might imagine in between deep learning and the human brain. Welcome, Patrick, to the channel for this bit of a special episode, I guess.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I got sort of knowledge of you through your article 2021 in Review, Unsupervised Brain Models. You wrote down what happened in the last year in terms of the connection of deep learning and how to explain the brain. What is your background in this area? How did you come to be in this in-between space between neuroscience and AI?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually originally studied physics, and after my undergrad, I figured, maybe I don't want to do string theory for the rest of my life. Like it sounds like some of the questions that to ask interesting questions, you need to really be pretty advanced. But I think in neuroscience, there's some questions that are pretty ripe for the picking and that are obvious for even somebody that's pretty far outside the field. So, for instance, what is sleep? What does it do? That's like a pretty easy question. That's very hard to answer. So I went to do a PhD in computational neuroscience at McGill. And one of the fields of my study was really that intersection of neuroscience and artificial intelligence. Now, when I started my PhD, which was in 2008, deep learning really wasn't a thing. I guess like some of the original papers by Bengio and Jeffrey Hinton they were out, but the big event, I think, in presenting deep learning to the world and saying like this is ready, this is a big deal, was ImageNet 2012, right? As you know, so that was during my PhD. So at the very start of my PhD presentation and my PhD defense, I would say something like, look, you have neurons in inferotemporal cortex, which is one part of the visual stream, and they're able to do visual recognition. I would present examples of these neurons, and they're invariant and to things like lighting, rotation, scale, etc. We don't know how to make a computer that does that. But if I gave this presentation just 6 months or a year later, I would never have been able to say that, because people have been like, you could just get, even AlexNet would be able to do that. So that's a little bit my story, my introduction to NeuroAI. So I was there during that transition towards deep learning. And in fact, at the end of my PhD, I was working on deep learning to try and explain some of the brain areas that I cared about. Now, these brain areas are the areas of the dorsal stream, and those are really brain areas that really care about motion. And so I was poking around with what was, I'm going to date myself. I was poking around in Theano back in the day to make this happen, which I guess has fallen by the wayside. But so I've been at this intersection for quite a while now.
Awesome. Well, that it seems like it was an exciting time. I do remember Theano as well, so I'm definitely dated the same. So the dorsal stream, just to make clear, that's part of sort of the visual stream into the brain. Is that correct? Or
Yeah. So maybe I can give you like the first minute of my thesis defense, because I've got it engraved in my brain. You just you defended not too long ago, right?
True.
Exactly. So I'm sure you're gonna.
I forgot it completely.
Oh yeah. You just like put it in a box in your brain and just it's gone. Okay. So the visual information falls on the retina, and it's originally encoded in these very simple formats in terms of differences in luminance between like a center and a surround, or differences in time. So you can think of it as a camera with like a little bit of linear filtering. And it then gets forwarded to different areas of the brain, first to the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then to the back of the brain, the occipital cortex, which is called the primary visual cortex. So that's a huge area, a huge chunk of the brain. And you have tons of neurons which are selective for vision there. And from there, the visual processing splits into two different substreams. There's the ventral visual stream, which is the object stream. So if you think like, what does a ResNet 50 that's trained on ImageNet do? Maybe it's something similar to that, and we can get into that later. And then there's another set of areas, which is the dorsal stream. Again, organized in a hierarchical fashion. Again, you have like these, for instance, you have increases in the size of receptive fields. You have increases in the complexity of things that these neurons respond to. But this time, they don't care about form. They don't care they don't care about texture. What they really care about is motion. So, you're going to poke at a neuron in, let's say, the middle temporal area, which is part of the dorsal stream, and 80 or 90% of the neurons will respond when you show them the right moving stimulus. Which is remarkable.
So in your article, you go a little bit into both of these streams, and I think one of the main focuses that you care about is are or are not the deep learning networks we use today similar to what the brain does? Because sure, we've built these systems that can do some visual tasks, but does that bring us closer to understanding how the brain does certain things? And the answer is, right? The answer is a little bit yes and a little bit no. Like there's still questions, but you point out a bunch of areas of where progress has been made in correlating, let's say, neural activities in deep neural networks with neural activities in brains. So, yeah.
I think that it might be good to just back up a little bit and talk about the that world at large, so that people are just tuning in, haven't read the article yet, will understand what we're discussing. I think that originally some of the so I was talking about ImageNet 2012, which was the big milestone in creating good deep neural networks that could solve the kinds of tasks that humans can solve. Now, there was a lot of background work that came into that. One is, the creation of convolutional neural networks, and the work from Jan LeCun, which was ultimately, inspired by the neocognitron, which is Fukushima, like in around the early 80s. But ultimately, that work was motivated a lot by some early work in vision and in vision neuroscience. So David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel in the 50s and 60s looked at different kinds of neurons in the primary visual cortex, and were able to find that you have this hierarchy of selectivity, right? So the canonical thing that they found is they found cells which were tuned for orientation, right? So you present an edge like this or a line like this, and the cell responds. Mm-hmm. But if the line, if instead of being white, it's black, then it doesn't respond. So those are called the simple cells. And then they found another subset of cells, which are called the complex cells. And so those are selective for this, but they would be, it wouldn't matter the precise location of this line in question. And it wouldn't matter the contrast. So it could be white to black, or it could be black to white. Yep. It wouldn't matter. And so their hunch was that, okay, well, you have this transformation that happens. First of all, you have a selectivity operation, which creates that simple cell. So basically just a threshold, and that's enough to give you a selectivity. Or it could be a ReLU if you, smooth it out. And then there's a pooling operation that happens. So you pool from different simple cells that have the same orientation selectivity but different contrast sensitivity. And that creates the complex cell. And you can view that as a subsampling operation or downsampling operation, as you would have in a deep neural net. So there's this kind of long line of like, oh, there's the inspiration from the brain. We're going to make some models. We're going to show that they're actually good enough to solve tasks that humans can solve. But the question is, okay, are these like really like human brains? And that's some of the work from in Jim DiCarlo's lab and Nico Krieger-Skorte in 2014, like really showed that there's some very tantalizing hints that this is indeed the case. That these networks that we've trained on ImageNet, they look a lot like the brain in really interesting ways. And one of the big ways that they're similar is that if you look at let's say 10 different networks. And one of them is, some of them turned out to be a little bit better at solving ImageNet or a little bit worse. And then you correlate that with how well you can align these networks to the brain. It turns out that the ones which perform better on ImageNet tend to also perform better on explaining the brain, which is like a very strange coincidence, because think of how like completely different these two things have been created. So that was one of the big hints. And I think like another big hint is the work from Chris Olah and other people at OpenAI that looked inside of these deep neural networks and found that, the kinds of selectivity that you see inside the cells, they're very, very similar to what a neurophysiologist would describe in areas like V1, V2, V4, infratemporal cortex. So the combination of the quantitative and qualitative tells us like, hey, maybe these are kind of like little brains. Yeah. One very, very specific part of the brain. I want to be
you get into a lot of trouble if you say that statement unqualified, right?
Exactly.
So what do people mean when they say something like explains the brain or something aligns with brain activity? Like what is it? What is behind that?
Yeah. So we can talk about the high level stuff, like
sure, just like the idea of how like what do we measure? Like, is it a number? Is it a correlation? Or is it am I training a regression model from one signal to the other signal? Like how can I make the statement that this neural network explains some function in the brain?
So in the early work from 2014, we see two different approaches being used, and those are the kinds of approaches, like every other approach that's been tried is kind of a derivative of these like two basic concepts. So one approach is a regression-based approach. So very simply, let's say you train a ResNet 50 on ImageNet. You chop it off at some layer 4 after the first downsampling or whatever. And then you measure the output of that deep neural network with respect to some stimulus ensemble. So which gives you a big matrix, big X, which has a bunch of rows for the different examples and a bunch of columns for the different features. And then you just regress that against neural data that's recorded with the same images. And it's just a regression. So you can add like a bunch of different spices into your basic recipe. So you can add some sparseness priors. You can try to, usually you'll use a ridge regression rather than a straight regression, because that will definitely, the regular regression will usually crash and burn. Neural data is very noisy. That's something that people don't often appreciate. And so it's a regression. Let's just put it that way.
Now, that would be sort of, for example, fMRI data when we talk about neural data.
It can be fMRI data. It can be MEG data. So magnetoencephalograph. I think we just say MEG, or it could be a single neuron recordings or array recordings. So those are taken inside the brain, or it might be ECOG, which is just on the surface of the brain. So there's different kinds of recordings. Now, it happens that fMRI and MEG are much more popular for humans because it's non-invasive, but every once in a while people get to record inside of the brains of humans that have some sort of need for brain surgery, whether usually it's epilepsy, and those data are very precious.
Now, speaking of, so you go through different papers in your article, so maybe we can follow that structure a little bit. The first one is a work that shows that the ventral stream might be explainable by, and your idea, the article also goes into, it's called unsupervised brain models. So your kind of point that you make is, or your investigation is into unsupervised systems, like how good or how close to what the brain does comes from these self-supervised and unsupervised systems. So the first thing you go into is the ventral stream. That is, you said, the sort of object stream. And this paper looks at single neuron activations, right? And they find that the self-supervised systems can be or are equally or even better able to explain the brain data than supervised systems, let's say in an image recognition task.
Yeah, so that's super exciting. And the reason is that I think that everybody got very excited when they saw that these networks, which were trained for ImageNet, they could be aligned to the ventral stream, to that object recognition stream. Because now it's something that, you have this in silico thing, and it kind of looks like it does the same thing as the brain. And so it's kind of a model of the brain. Super exciting. You can do a lot of things with it. But there's different ways in which something can be a model of the brain. And some of these are a little bit more useful than others. And one of the ways, one of the big flaws, I think, for supervised learning is that it's not like really it's not really a model of how the brain would learn a task. Because I'm not walking around as a baby and my parent just tells me dog, 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 cat, dog, just constantly for years and years. So we don't really use unsupervised learning for learning these kinds of things. So that's a big flaw that. If we want to move forward with models which are biologically plausible instantiations of creating these models, then we have to move away from supervised learning. So people generally like unsupervised learning and self-supervised learning better for that reason, because you don't have to, come up with this weird concept that of dog, 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 cat. But you do have to do the math to make sure that it actually does work out in practice, and that the kinds of the quantity of examples that you feed into the model is similar to the quantity of examples that you would feed into a human, for instance.
I think you have in your conclusion you have a little bit of an example that it would, like, the language models that we train, such as GPT-3, would be equivalent to years and years and years of human
of just
Yeah,
constant, just
yeah.
talking and talking
And
and
babies
talking,
are able
right? Because
to do
GPT,
it by age, what, 4 or so, or 2. Yeah.
exactly. So I think that there's still a big gap there that comes from that. You still, I mean, we're off. I think I calculated that we're off by 4 orders of magnitude in terms of the
Yeah.
efficiency. But you know, I'm to score everybody on the same kind of curve. I mean, the GPT-3 is not made as a model of the
Sure.
brain. I mean, it's made as a language model and to solve all these problems in zero-shot settings, and it works very well for its purposes. But definitely, if we want to actually try to explain the brain, we'll need to get to that.
And so it is also a bit special because we talk about the ventral stream. You said that's the object stream. And the fact that self-supervised systems are equal or better at explaining that than supervised systems, which presumably are trained exactly on the task of that such an object stream would be sensitive to, right? That is also one special thing.
So I totally agree. I mean, that's super cool that that this is the case. That you have this this thing where you don't give it like learn objects, and yet it learns something that can do object recognition, and it learns meaningful meaningful things like that. But I think that there's a couple of hidden assumptions there that make this not nearly as mysterious as we would like it to be. So one is that, you know, ImageNet is not really, if your model of ImageNet is not, you take like a nice Canon DLSR and you know, you put it at a random point in space, and then you point it at somewhere random, and then you hit the button, right? So if we look at both of our faces right now, we're in the center of the screen. It turns out that you know, we're smart like that, that we place our faces like generally in the center of the screen when we take photos. So the things that we try to look at in ImageNet, you know, the subject of the category will by and large be in the center. And you know, the position of the camera, the things that we tend to measure, I mean, these all come into why the model learns the thing that it learns. So it's not, we can't really say, you know, we're not like really feeding it any structural priors. We definitely do. We definitely do, just in not like the conventional way, and not in a way that's very easy to quantify either. But some people are definitely trying to solve these problems. So for instance, there's a lot of work on trying to fit the same kinds of unsupervised learning models, but with streams of data that look more like what a baby would see in their early years. In which the camera is not always pointed at the right things, because babies tend to.
I see. Yeah.
Do a lot of gesturing.
But it's also there. It's special because the baby, with time, is able to move its head, right? And therefore, it's also not the same as just placing a camera somewhere, because whatever captures attention will be actively looked at more. So it's definitely, like, I think there's a long way to go in any of these things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think so. To close just that one paper, because we've been on it for like 15 minutes, but super cool that you can have you can train a model in an unsupervised or self-supervised manner, and it turns out to be just as good at explaining, you know, V1, V4, and IT, all these different sub areas of the ventral stream. And then there's a kind of hierarchy that happens between the different models. So, you know, some models are clearly doing better than others. So typically in these papers, SimClear is usually the one that performs the best for reasons that we don't totally understand. Local aggregation also tends to do better. So that's interesting. Like, what is it about what's inside of these models that allows them to be more similar to the brain? Now, of course, in the end, you know, you end up with like tiny error bars, and it can be pretty difficult to actually differentiate between these different things. So, you know, you can't like read too much into it. But definitely the best models are like the new kind of generation of self-supervised models.
And then, so the next paper deals with the other stream, with the dorsal stream, and there you, or yes, that is actually you who found some. That's your own paper, right?
Oh yeah, so I'll
Yeah.
just go very rapidly with through the second one is ventral stream
Oh, sorry.
again, and so that's
Yeah.
from Talia Konkel, and very consistent data. So they use fMRI rather than single neuron data, but I mean the data is like these two studies were done independently. About a kilometer away from each other, one team from Harvard and one team from MIT, and they found exactly the same results. So maybe something's in the water in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but otherwise, I mean, it's a very robust finding, basically. But yeah, we can definitely talk about the dorsal stream. So, like I said, I've been interested in this problem for a very long time, and I had a little bit of time during the last lockdown of the pandemic to relook at this problem. And so we sat down and we said, you know, I think like the time is ripe to really look at all this dorsal stream data and see if we can get one really good model of all these different areas. So the first thing that I did actually is I was going about this very naively, but I just looked into like the torch vision models. You know, they have like some model database, and just downloaded all the models that were trained on video recognition. So all the models that were trained on I'm drawing a blank here. Kinetics 400, which is a task where you have to look at a video of somebody juggling and say, oh, it's juggling rather than unicycling, rather than soccer or whatever. And so the special thing about these models that they look at 3D data. By 3D, I mean spatial temporal, right, in time. And so that means that and generally they're trained, the convolutional neural nets, they're trained with 3D filters. So, you know, the front end of the model is going to be a 3D convolution in space and time. And so I looked at these models and I did the kinds of visualization tricks that Chris Ola and gang do at OpenAI to look inside, because I was curious, you know, do they learn motion? Do they align with the brain? And I found that they were actually like really terrible, which surprised me, because if you look into the methods of these papers, it's like we trained these models for 24 hours on a supercomputer with 16 GPUs in parallel, and went through a million videos, and this is the model that we obtain, and they're very good at doing the test that they're doing, and yet the kinds of generic features that come out of the models are really terrible at aligning with the brain. So that was kind of the hunch that we saw there. That I should say that one of the early findings and one of the early points that people who were dubious about the finding that the ventral streams align with ImageNet trained ResNets and AlexNets and VGG nets is that people will say, well, you're just training the model to do a task, any sort of task will work. It doesn't matter whether it's object recognition or whatever. It just turns out that this is the task that you had data on. But this is a very good like counterexample of that, because you train a model on a task which involves 3D data, video spatial temporal data, and yet that model is actually the model that you train is really good for that one task, but is really terrible at this task of aligning with the brain. So that motivated us to look more deeply into what else could the like if we don't take pre-trained models to solve this problem, like what could we do? And we know that a lot of the dorsal visual stream really cares about navigation. So if you look at an area like MST, have you ever had vertigo?
Sure.
Yeah. So vertigo is like kind of a, sorry, this is like a weird non sequitur, but vertigo is kind of a funny thing, right? Because it's an inner ear
Yeah.
problem, right? So you have your vestibule, and it basically tells you there's acceleration in ways that there shouldn't be acceleration, and that gives you an impression of being dizzy. But it also gives you like these weird visual effects,
Yeah.
right? Which is strange. Or if you drink a little too much, you might have that same kind of feeling. So there's an area in the brain which is called MST, which has these neurons which receive both visual input and vestibular input. And the way that they receive visual input is they have a lot of selectivity for things like rotation and expansion and wide field translation.
Yeah.
And so we think that they're really involved in navigation. So if you're going forward in a line, you have these neurons which receive both the vestibular input, so they know how you're accelerating and where gravity is, and they receive all this wide field optic flow, which tells you where you're heading. So we said, why don't we train a deep neural network to solve a navigation task, so that the network can orient itself in space, essentially. So I used an environment which is it's an environment for drone simulation. It's called AirSim, and it's really fun. So it's an Unreal Engine. And you can basically fly a drone in these suburban environments and back out these sequences of videos, and then you can train a convolutional neural net, 3D ResNet, to solve the problem of figuring out what is from a little sequence of movement, what is the trajectory basically that's going on, like where are you heading. Are you rotating? Are you going forward, et cetera, et cetera? And so if you train a network on that, it turns out that if you visualize the cells inside of the trained network, they really, really look like what you would see in the visual cortex. So as a neurophysiologist, or as an amateur neurophysiologist, or a person that's been in the vicinity of neurophysiologists, I was really stoked to see this. So you see these cells that are selective for translation and translation, but they don't care about the pattern that underlies the translation. And in particular, you see these cells like the one that you're visualizing here, that like things like spirals in some of the higher level layers of this network, which was super exciting, because those look a lot like what you would see in MST. So basically,
the networks that try to just predict anything from a video that contains motion aren't like, it turns out these the deep networks, I have to stop saying neural networks here because it's ambiguous. The deep networks that train on any kind of video data, they're not super well aligned with the brain. However, as soon as you go maybe to like some sort of an ego perspective, right, and you predict your own parameters of motion. So from the visuals, you're trying to predict, okay, I went to the left, I went to the right, I turned around from the visual information, and that turns out to align very well with the brain data. Does that make, like, just maybe an esoteric question, but does that say anything about the need for AI to be embodied, maybe?
Oh, I love this question. Yes, 100%. Yes, we should completely embody AI.
Yeah.
So I think that one big question that came up during the review is that, we claimed originally this was unsupervised or self-supervised in the abstract. And then the reviewers came back and said, well, it's not really unsupervised or self-supervised. It's a supervised network, because, you know what the answer is. You're just training in a supervised fashion. Yeah. My feeling is that it is self-supervised in the sense of when you embody this in an agent. So when I'm a baby, let's imagine that I'm a baby and I'm walking around the world. I have some control over where I'm heading.
Yeah.
Right. So I can say, like, I'm going to turn this way. I'm going to turn that way. I'm going to move forward. I'm going to go get that cookie. I'm going to look at my parent. and so forth. So I am an agent.
Yep.
So that means that I control the motion that comes into my eyes.
Yep.
Because the vast majority of motion that we see in the world comes from our self motion, and so I can correlate my motor plans with what I see in the world, and that means that it's a much easier kind of problem to correlate these two things than to say here's found data,
Yeah.
which is the case of ImageNet, and figure out something to model with this.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yes, you also have this diagram here from Yann LeCun talking about self-supervised learning, and it seems very much that it is. I agree the line is like gray in some places, but it seems like if you are an embodied agent, you always have those motion parameters ready, right? So it's much more like I am going to darken out part of what I already know and try to predict that from it. It seems it falls a lot into this diagram right here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it looks more like the bottom part of this diagram that you see there, where you have these two things which are happening in the present, but one part is occluded and the other part is visible.
Yep.
So you're doing multimodal masking, in other words, right? So you have the vision, but now you're trying to predict the vestibular, or you have the vestibular and you're trying to predict the vision. And so if you look something like CLIP would be, I think, like maybe the most popular model that's of the same kind of multimodal kind. You can say, well, CLIP is a supervised model because you're trying to predict, in a way, you're trying to predict language from vision. But it's really this kind of masking, and I think it's a more general approach to solving this type of problem. So yeah, I agree with you. Embodied agents, I'm 100% on board. They're definitely going to be awesome, and actually questions about what do reinforcement learning agents learn? Do they learn like good self motion representations, for instance, when they have a visual task? I think like those are super interesting. Like, what do you need to put in there in order to get that effect?
Yeah, that concept of me in AIs is not yet really come through so far, but I'm also looking into I'm looking forward to having more of AIs who understand the concept of me and to be embodied and sort of to have self state and all of this kind of stuff. I think that will bring us forward. So here in the next paper, you tackle this paper you're describing, it tackles the question.
Oh, it's the same people.
It is actually. I just saw in my notes that is again one of your papers. It is the question: why are there even two different of these visual streams in the brain? Like, it maybe makes sense if we sit down, but also you find some actual empirical evidence for why it might be that we even have two streams, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's an interesting question. Like, why are there two things rather than one, or four things, or eight things rather than an arbitrary number? So Shahab, who's the first author on this paper, worked on looking at what it would take to recreate both ventral and dorsal stream. And I think the remarkable thing that he found is if you train a network like a CPC network, so a contrastive predictive coding network, which is one form of self-supervised learning in which you're trying to essentially discriminate between different futures, if you will. So you look at the past, like a certain window in the past, and then you're trying to tell apart like the actual future embedded in some subspace versus an alternative future, which is dreamt up. So if you try to do that, then it's already been shown that you can find good representations in videos. But what's very interesting is that then you can ask the question of what happens as you add more and more substreams inside of this network. So if you remember the original AlexNet paper, so
it had two streams, right? Yeah.
It did have two streams. So if you remember, like it is like a while ago, but what happened is that they had like tiny GPUs back in the day, right? And so they couldn't fit the whole model on just one GPU. So what they decided arbitrarily is to split it up into two parts, especially at the early part.
Yeah.
And then basically they were independent, but they could recommunicate a little bit later on. So which was a pretty unique feature back then. People didn't really do that. But now it's quite common to, chop up the channels in different ways and all sorts of things. But what they found is that there's this very interesting self-organization principle where all the filters on one GPU turned out to be color selective, and all the filters on the other GPU turned out to be black and white, which is, whoa, that's weird.
Just by the fact of splitting up, because the two streams, they don't always communicate, right? They only communicate at very sparse intermediate points. So just this structural prior gives rise to something that very much looks like the brain in the sense that one of the streams correlates well with the ventral brain stream and one correlates well with the dorsal brain stream.
Yeah. So in that case, in the early AlexNet paper, actually both of the types of filters are different subtypes that you see in V1, but they are functionally different and they have different roles. But it was like kind of an interesting proof of concept that if you just set a separation, arbitrary separation down the middle, you don't say anything else. Like you don't say like you have to respond to color, you have to respond to this, but just you set a separation. It self-organizes into something that's interesting.
It's crazy.
And it's weird.
So they might have just locked themselves into like building a better model by having two small GPUs.
Yeah, exactly. So, they say that the necessity is the mother of invention. So I think this is a particular case where, the limitations at the time caused them to stumble onto something which I think is really deep and interesting. Which is symmetry breaking. So I guess ultimately, when you start with, you could imagine that if you just set all the weight parameters to 0 and then you perform your gradient descent, these two filtered sets will learn exactly the same thing, or they'll crash and burn. But by adding a little noise, right, by initializing your network, you're pushing the network very, very slightly out of equilibrium. And that's enough to self-organize into this thing. And so Shahab found a very similar phenomenon in the context of these networks which are trained in an unsupervised manner in CPC. And so being trained on videos was able to find that these parts of one part of the network was... And so again, this is an instance of a network that has kind of a firewall in between the two sets of filters. And so he was able to find that these two sub-branches, one of them was dorsal-like and the other one was ventral-like, and was able to correlate that with some data that we have in mouse, where there's tons and tons of data on what's the relative selectivity of these different things, and found some really nice correlations. Cool. So that means that you can, all you would need basically is a little bit of a nudge, right? And so which is this great idea. Like maybe you just initialize the network so that like the two things are just very slightly asymmetric. Because one thing I should say is that the two networks don't always get the same label, right? So if you train the network twice, one time it's going to be dorsal ventral, and another time it's going to be ventral dorsal. Whereas the brain, every time that you train it,
it's the same
that we know
so
of.
There are some
exactly. It's all ventral is ventral, dorsal is dorsal. So there's some like inbuilt asymmetry, but it's probably like a very small asymmetry, because if you train it with real data, and then it will automatically self-generate into this and bloom into this particular activity.
Cool.
So very exciting.
This could be
that the brain can organize itself for something that's useful from.
This could be used, I guess, for. I mean, people are already in multi-head attention. They do multi-head, right? And that's kind of similar in that they clearly separate different computation that cannot interconnect, and therefore that sort of they're also like the random initialization probably does some symmetry breaking, and then you find that the different heads respond to different things. People have investigated that. It's probably very much along the same lines. So I want to skip ahead a little bit here to the concept cells, is it this paper?
Oh, this is wild. I think I think that there's been a lot of movement in
Yeah.
the subfield. And by the way, I want to tell your viewers, because I know a lot of you viewers are coming from a machine learning background versus a neuroscience background. And it's hard to get into neurops, but I think it's such a wide open field in neuroscience. There's so many questions that if you care a lot about representation learning, it's a pretty easy field to jump onto, and have positive reception. So there's still a bunch of questions. So grab your nearest neuroscientist and go write a paper. Encourage everybody to do it.
Yep. Definitely how to hack Neuro's publications. There you go.
Yeah, there you go. So clip. Clip is weird. So if there's one thing that I would say is when we saw the results of clip and some of the both in terms of how good it is, and also the inner visualizations that Chris Ola and gang worked on, Chelsea Voss as well. I think that we were all kind of surprised because they do look a lot like the kinds of concept cells that you see in the hippocampus, right? So the very, 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 very famous paper that did this had the infamous Jennifer Aniston cell. So I don't know if you ever heard
in the context of your article. So it's one cell that responds to both what pictures and the name and various aspects of a person, not just like
Exactly. So if I remember correctly, this paper, so they had people with intractable epilepsy. So these are human patients, and they were doing probe recordings in the hippocampus to figure out what was the nature of their epilepsy and how they could be treated. And they spend a lot of time in the hospital just being bored. And so sometimes they enroll into experiments, and these experiments tell us more about the human brain than is otherwise possible. And so very thankful for these people that do this. So in this particular instance, they presented different kinds of concepts and images. And one of the cells that they found had this like amazing property that if you just show the words Jennifer Aniston, it would respond. If you showed the face of Jennifer Aniston, it would respond. If you showed, they didn't do like other kinds of controls, but I imagine that if they had played, at the start of the Friends show, it probably would have responded, because it all came with this like general concept of Jennifer Aniston. Ever since then, people have been like fascinated by this idea, although it's a much older idea, this idea that you have like a cell in your hippocampus that responds to your grandmother. It's the grandmother cell idea. But one thing that was very interesting when we first saw CLIP is that you have cells can respond both to text and to images, and in fact, you can do these new kinds of adversarial attacks in which you just write the wrong text, and it fools the system into actually reading the text and mislabeling the images. So it sounds very hippocampus-like to me. And so in this particular paper, they actually looked at this problem and found that out of all the different models that they could look, they found that CLIP could explain the most hippocampal data, which is super exciting. And I'm sure that people are really going to drill down further into this finding. But it's CLIP specifically, because there's a lot of other unsupervised models, and somehow CLIP is the best, and we still don't understand why this is. I mean, it's like the delta between it and the second best model is huge. But why? I think no one knows right now. And actually, clip the visual aspects of clip are also very good at explaining some of the some other data. So it's very interesting to think about what happens in a multimodal fashion. Like what happens when, experimentalists and neurophysiologists really like to isolate one thing, to just look at one thing at a time. But now you're talking about something that can do different kinds of modalities. And I think that, multimodal areas are going to be some of the next things that are really attacked by unsupervised and self-supervised.
I mean, it's also a
methods.
question. I mean, clip is huge. It also has a huge amount of data. We don't exactly know what data went into there, right? So there's a lot to untangle here. But the multimodality, I also feel that is a big part of what's going to bring us forward in AI, and probably also, since the brain is always multimodal. Like you don't get like a stimulus that is, maybe now with computers you do. But, just growing up in nature, you probably get zero stimuli that are just unimodal, right? So you're always in this mode of multimodality.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting, in particular for babies, if you ever interacted with babies, they really like to have toys which make lots of noise, which drives parents crazy. But I think that there's a reason for that, right? Like, why would you want a toy that makes a lot of noise? Because clearly there's a lot of pressure on making the noise as silent as possible, because the parents are just trying to sleep. But I think that the kids just prefer that because it's a multimodal stimuli, and you can do all sorts of causal inference about what happens when I hit this thing with this thing.
So this is the last paper that I wanted to look at. Maybe you have more, but this challenges the manifold perspective of deep learning. You've described it a little bit in the paragraph. You say it challenges the manifold perspective and it favors the causal perspective. So what is meant here, and what does this paper tell us?
Oh, yeah. So remember, we were discussing earlier the mechanics of how you compare a brain area and a deep neural network. And so you could have, so I think a lot of deep learning methods are rotation invariant. So if you take something like CLIP, for instance, you're learning, I guess, this subspace, which is, I guess, 128 dimensional. Both from the visual side and from the text side, and you're trying to align it in this 128 dimensional space. If you multiply the two by rotation matrix, and then the entire 128 dimensional space gets rotated, it's the same network, right? It really doesn't matter whether it's rotated or not. What matters is just the locations on the manifolds. And so if you're thinking about aligning a brain area and a neural network with a regression, again, the rotation doesn't matter. You're saying any weight matrix is just as good as any other weight matrix. So that's the that's the underlying I think assumption. And I think that there's been a lot of work recently in neuroscience focusing on this idea that, single neurons don't really matter. What matters is the latent subspace in which the neurons are responding. So if you have a population of 100,000 neurons, maybe it's 100,000 neurons, but if you present a bunch of stimuli, you find out that actually the latent and you do an SVD on the matrix of responses, you find that the latent subspace is actually just 5-dimensional or whatever. So first of all, they're just random projections from this 5-dimensional subspace, and the large dimensional subspace doesn't really matter. So this paper, it's been a lot of work in neuroscience showing that this is the case, especially in motor cortex. So, you have tons and tons of neurons in your motor cortex as you're going for a reach movement. And yet it seems that these neurons really live in a very low dimensional subspace. So that's what we call the manifold theory of neuroscience. Is that idea that the neurons are in a high dimensional subspace, but they're just random projections of some lower dimensional subspace. But one of the consequences that if it's random projections, then each of the neurons individually should just be, weird. It should, respond to a bunch of different things. It shouldn't. You shouldn't be able to place a label
because you could
that neuron.
So you could rotate the entire space. It would still make sense, right? So there's no reason why an individual neuron should align with just like one axis in that particular subspace.
Yeah, exactly. But neuroscientists really like labeled axes. That's one thing that they're very fond of. So you can imagine that you have like an axis. I don't know if you're in Unity or in Unreal, you have like my avatar, and then you just like hit like one switch, and then it just go, it just changes my smile from upwards to downwards, and oh, sorry, my printer is haunted, and so I'm just gonna disconnect it if you don't mind, because it makes the lights flash, unfortunately. Okay. Sorry.
I find it weird that printers are like the oldest technology on the planet, yet still they're like the most troubled. Like we should have figured this out by now, but we have not.
Yeah, it's too bad. So I still print out papers because there's been research that shows that you retain more when you print something out rather when you read it in on a printed document rather than reading it on but it's just becoming so inconvenient that I think I'm going to have to abandon soon. Okay, so starting back then, and I apologize. Where do you want me to restart?
So there's no particular reason why any single neuron, right, should align with any axis. Yet people find that they do. Yes,
exactly. And that might be because, neuroscientists like to name things. And if something is not nameable, they'll say it's mixed selectivity or whatever, and then they'll just forget about it. That's also a very good assumption. So both of these things could be happening at the same time. But in this paper, they found that if you train a beta VAE, which is a VAE which has a stronger weight on one of the KL terms, it tends to find disentangled representations, right? So that the axes actually matter. So one axis is like my smile, the other axis is how much of a unibrow I have, and a third axis is what's up with my mustache, and et cetera, et cetera. And so they found that aligns pretty well with some neurons in one phase selective area of infratemporal cortex. And so they did some trickery trying to do like one-on-one alignment versus ensemble alignment. And it looks like, the good interpretation for this data is that it's more like a one-on-one alignment. And so that could be pretty interesting. But I do want to point out that there are certainly distributed representations in the brain. It doesn't mean that because in this one area you have non-distributed representations that's the case for the whole brain. And it might be because of energetic reasons that we have this representation in this brain area, because you want to have what the distribution of responses is over a stimulus ensemble is very important for how efficient the code is, because remember, neurons are super noisy, right? So you want them, you want to have like a nice exponential distribution of responses in order to have an efficient code, given that you have this Poisson-like noise in the data.
So and you say it favors the causal hypothesis. So it means that maybe what's happening is that rather than simply encoding the signal that you see, that the brain is actually building like a causal model of what's happening. Like, there are eyes and there are eyebrows, and that, the the result of there being eyebrows is that they look a certain way.
Yeah.
And then it would make sense again that they are encoded, like the structural prior is encoded in one space, and then simply the manifestation of that is the picture we see.
Yeah. Maybe I misused the term causal here. I don't want to mistake it for causal inference, and
Sure, yeah.
But I think that what I mean by this is a forward model for how like one individual.
Exactly.
So you can think of you can think of a directed acyclic graph in which there's a bunch of different factors. One of them is whether or not I wake up with a mustache today. Another one is how close my eyes are. Another one is my nose, and these factors are disentangled. So that means that they're independent from each other, and then I can just like turn on and off the switch and generate different faces. So that's I think like the underlying naive model is the Mr. Potato Head model, right? In which you just like switch out the different the different components, and of course there are specific holes that you can put the the different things in. So I think that I guess like the question is like, are these factors in this factor graph, are they like, can you put labels on them and they correspond to one thing that we would identify as something that is independently changeable? So for instance, like we understand that age and lighting, for instance, like those are two totally disentangled things that have nothing to do with each other. So the question is, are they different factors, or are you rotated, like one is square root of 2, like 1 over square root of 2 times age minus 1 over square root of 2 times lighting, and so on and so forth. And it looks like they're really aligned towards towards the factors that we can label and that are indeed independent. Both in brains and in this particular model.
Do you think that it plays a big part because let's say facial structure is something that is truly, let's say, the individual factors are actually independent because of genetic variation, allele crossing during meiosis, or recombination, and so on. These things actually go in a fairly, let's say, uncorrelated uniform distribution in the human population. So almost every combination of narrow eyes, wide eyes, big mouth, small mouth, and so on is possible. And therefore it might make just sense to, let's say, encode the individual factors as individual neurons, as you say, maybe for energetic reasons.
I think that's a really interesting hypothesis, but I don't think that's the case. I think that there might be like a general, algorithm that tries to disentangle these things into different subfactors, and that as a consequence, there's this natural alignment with this other process. But and of course, if it's the case that the kind of latent model that is inside the brain is better aligned with the latent model that's in reality, well, that's better. You want the thing to reflect, but I don't think it's 100% true that these factors are really disentangled in reality. So, for instance, I like a unibrow versus mustache. Like these two things are probably pretty correlated with each other, right?
Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah. So we've been going through this a little bit. There's other papers which are definitely also interesting, like the gloss.
Yeah, I really wanted to.
Ones is super interesting. Is there one that you wanted to touch on particularly?
Well, I wanted to give for readers that are coming slightly outside of this field and moving into this like very rapidly moving field, kind of an overview of what are the questions that people are interested in, like what are kind of some of the interesting approaches that people are using to tackle these, and also encourage people to come in our field and get papers in and and scoop us basically. So I really want to encourage people to get into that. I think that we've covered some of the papers that I think are the most interesting. And we'll see I actually wanted to do a follow-up on precisely the kind of agent-based representations that are coming, because that is coming down the line. And I think that's going to be super interesting for this field. So maybe we can end with like some things to look forward to in the future.
Sure.
One of the things that I think is going to be interesting for the future is like really taking evolution seriously. So we saw actually, maybe if you can scroll to where I show Jess Thompson's diagram of the different types of models and how they all fit together. It's at the very start. Yeah. It's at the intro. So Jess is a really nice way, I think, of explaining this. Which is that, there's some models which can really perform a task. And, once we got the ImageNet 2012, like that was where we got there. And then, in 2014, we really got into this accounts for neural activity part of, we can find models that can both perform a task which is biologically relevant and accounts for neural activity. I think this year was a big year for biological plausibility. And I don't want to say this is the last word, because clearly there's way more work to be doing there. You're going to have models which have realistic, biologically realistic kinds of gradient descent, or replace gradient descent with something that's more biologically plausible. You're going to have Dale's law, so excitatory neurons only make only makes excitatory connections, and inhibitory neurons only make inhibitory connections, and you'll have normalization, and you'll have temporal dynamics, and so on and so forth. So that's like the next 5 years is probably just going to be to fill in this biologically plausible. But there's also could have evolved. I think that's like a super interesting unknown questions, and people are going to start to think about this problem in a serious fashion. And I want to point out there was this recent paper that I don't talk about here, which from Fei-Fei Li, which is about evolving different kinds of agents that can solve different kinds of reinforcement learning tasks. That actually has an interesting evolution component to it. Yeah. So I think we're going to start to see, and we can actually like see the process by which the brain can bootstrap itself into existence, which I think is going to teach us something about what it is to be human. And I'm sure there'll be TED Talks and books and so forth. Yeah. But that's going to take like another 5-10 years. Another thing that I'm excited to look at in the future is I just wrote in my notes here, hands. Hands are great. I think that one thing that we haven't like really taken seriously so far is the role of weak supervision from a parental perspective. But if you think of like a parent and their baby, they're going to point at things. They're going to say, this is this, this is that. And, it has had hands have had a huge role in our evolution as Homo sapiens. And it's even like thought that sign language preceded the appearance of voiced speech. So that we probably have somewhere in our noggins some areas which are highly selective for hand gestures and which are used for a kind of weak supervision that's important for parents. So understanding what happens with that personal space and what happens as we use tools is clearly important from like just that curiosity of how. We went from Australopithecus to modern humans, and I think it's going to teach us a lot about what it means to be human.
Awesome. Last question from my side. You're clearly interested in how the brain works, right? And seeing, can we make parallels between AI models, like deep models and brain areas and so on? Do you think that it is a necessity that we sort of feed back the knowledge into the deep learning realm. So should we put more effort into saying, how does the brain work? Okay, let's do that, because at least that's like one example of where intelligence was achieved. Or do you think that, how the brain works is just like a happenstance of nature and evolution and energy restrictions, and it's not super, like, let's just do AI, the way it works best? Or option 3 is something like, however we build AI, if we solve the task, it will automatically align with the brain, because there's like only one real way to solve the task. Like, in which of these, let's say, camps do you find yourself in?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I want to say that, so people have made for a long time that claim that if we just study the brain, we'll be able to make better machines. So that comes about and again. And I do want to point out that this actually did happen, as we saw with convolutional neural networks, and the whole story of Yuval and Weasel and the Neocognitron and Jan LeCun and eventually ImageNet 2012. But, it's really only happened a few times. It's not clear how much more we have to, how many more instances of this will happen. That's certainly the view from some people at DeepMind, for instance, that have really gone into cognitive neuroscience and have started to do their own fMRI experiments to really, tackle these problems. I think it's really, really interesting, but I think that it's going to teach us a lot about the human brain, but not necessarily about how to make intelligent machines, because these are different systems, as you point out. And there's certainly things about the brain which are kludgy and certainly suboptimal. So how the retina is wired up is the classic example. It's wired up the wrong way around. Octopuses have it the right way around, and it doesn't seem to bother them. So that's a clear example. But maybe there's something that we can identify with brains, and that is going to unlock the next generation of machine learning. Maybe it's spiking neural networks, for instance. People are demonstrating you could get something which is like 1,000 times or 10,000 times more energy efficient if you just used these mixed signal spiking neural networks. So I don't know.
Yeah, and that would, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, that is sort of the orders of magnitude you spoke about before when it came to data.
Well, those are, so here I'm thinking about the energy efficiency.
Sure.
So I think one recurring theme
not super comparable.
No,
but yeah.
I think the one thing I would point out here is that if you look at all these papers and you add up all of their training time and carbon emissions, it's probably pretty substantial. Although I will say that the paper that I'm the first author of here, I actually have the machine that I train this thing on right here. And it's still a 1 GPU machine. So again, I encourage your viewers to get into this, because you can still do things with one GTX 1080.
That's awesome.
But I think that one thing that's going to be really interesting is that by studying better machines, we'll be able to start to understand how to bring this back from the side of machine learning and bring it back into human health. So that's very interesting, and it's by and wide hasn't been explored thus far. But I'm kind of a fan of the opposite direction that most people are really going into. So I hope that answers your question. I don't think that naturally, if you just train a neural network to solve a task, it's going to do it the same way that the brain does, because I don't think that's really pointed out. I don't think that GPT-3 does things the same way that a human does in any sort of meaningful way. No way. Even though they're both very good at language.
Maybe GPT-4.
Well, if you ask Gary Marcus, he'll say that there's no way. It'll never happen.
Never.
Neurosymbolic AI all the way. Yeah.
All right. Cool. Yeah. To everyone, follow Patrick. He's written papers, lots of papers. You're also the CTO of Neuromatch Academy. Is that correct?
So I helped Neuromatch start actually. So I'm no longer CTO there, but it's a great occasion for people that want to learn more about that intersection between neuroscience and artificial intelligence. To bring that about. So when we started this a couple of years ago, we just figured, do a few video lectures and present that online. And it was at the start of the pandemic and people were bored. So the response was out of this world. We had over 2,000 applications and people from all over the world wanted to learn more about both neuroscience and artificial intelligence and their intersection. So we ended up having, I think, 1,700 students in the first cohort and having 200 TAs. And so it became a big thing very fast. So I'm very happy that I helped bring that about. It was definitely one of the most stressful times in my life, but we could bring together people from very disparate backgrounds, whether it's people in emerging economies that are at local universities there, and people from Ivy League universities in the U.S., Canada, and the U.K. Together and working with the same curriculum and under the same circumstances. So, which was very cool. And then last year we did the same, but doubled in size as well. So I hope that we'll be able to double this year. I'm sure the announcement actually for the next version of Neuromatch Academy will happen pretty soon.
Okay.
So if you have people in your audience that are interested in that, I highly recommend to them to do that. It's a great occasion to learn, and we already have materials from last year online. So if you want to get started on your learning, you can do that today.
Excellent. Cool. Well, Patrick, it was wonderful having you here. This is a new world to me, and I think to a lot of people listening right here. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you again with next year's review.
Awesome.